Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of What's Up with Power. My name is Justin Wagner with Team ODZ, and I will be your ride lead here on Zwift, as well as the host, introducing our guest presenter today. And today we've got Mr. Nate Dunn from Data Driven Athlete. And last time he was on, it was about 2 weeks ago, we gave a generic overview of training plans, and today we're going to drill down into more specifics and hopefully drive it home to something you can really chew on and ask some questions about. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Nate on the screen. Hey Nate.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on again.
How is the California weather? Still over 100 degrees?
Not over 100 degrees.
Oh.
We're battling a ton of fires here, but outside that natural disaster, it's the weather's pretty comfortable and sunny and perfect riding weather.
You know, it's perfect riding weather inside my shop right now. Actually, no rain.
That sounds about right.
Now it's actually pretty decent outside here. Still, it gets a little bit cold, and we're starting to have some frost in the mornings, so that does make things a little sketchy for you go up in the higher climbs. But
I will say that I did put my arm warmers on the other day, so if that makes you feel better.
Is that because it dropped below 60?
Yeah, it was about 55. I got to put the arm warmers on. Maybe a vest at 55. So
55 is when I go no arm warmers or nothing. 55 is like freedom for me.
Yeah, I bet.
Okay, group ride is starting. I want to pass it over to just you, Nate, let you present and take it from here.
Absolutely, yeah. So last time we were on, we kind of talked about some general concepts in terms of building a training plan, and today we're going to be taking a tighter focus on specific preparation for Criterium. So we could head to the next slide, please. Like we said before, to me, when we're talking about training plan design, we kind of have two options that work well. We have general concepts that hopefully most of you can apply to designing your own training plan, and then we have, really tight specifics on how we might prepare specifically for an event. So what we want to avoid in the attempt of this presentation to avoid is kind of this no man's land where we're talking generally. And I've seen presentations like this, and I've probably given them to at some point, and I don't think they're really applicable. So if you're finding that this presentation is too specific for you, and we're focusing in on maybe some things that don't apply to your training, then just jot down some questions, and you can ask those at the end of the show, or hopefully as we walk through some of these specifics of training plan design, my hope is that you kind of see the thought process for how to design a training plan, and even though it might not apply to your specific scenario, you can still use some of those things. So next slide, please. So before we get started in this kind of specific training plan design, we want to do a quick review on what we talked about last time, because that really serves as the foundation of how we're going to design a plan. So we talked about these 4 keys to designing a training plan. And the first one was to answer this why train question. If you need a review on this, you can go back and watch the other episode to kind of get a more in-depth look at these steps. But the first one is to answer a why train question. And we kind of talked about that already, and that this why train question for this training plan is that we want to prepare upcoming criteria. So that's our first kind of order of business in the why train question. Second one, sign up. Okay, great. We've signed up for this criterium. It's on our calendar, and it's about 6 weeks away. So that's going to give us an idea for the duration of this training plan design. The third step, we want to assess our time, and we've already done that, where we've got about 5 to 8 hours a week to train, and we've laid that out on the calendar. And then the fourth one, in our training plan, we want to apply progression throughout that plan, and we want to prove that we're making progress. So we're going to demonstrate how we do that in a plan, and then we're going to start by talking about that progress a little bit by going to the next slide. So this would be a demonstration of progression that we've made, let's say, over the winter months. So a lot of details on the slide here, and it's not important that you're able to see those specific details, but in general, we can see in this green line a steady increase in this rider's FTP, along with a trending increase in their 20-minute power, right? So this would be an example of we have demonstrated and we've proved that we've made progression in our aerobic fitness capacity or in our FTP throughout the winter. And that means that we're ready to kind of maybe start some more specific training to get ready for this criterium. So next slide, please. So we're going to make a couple assumptions before we start this specific training plan. And the first one is, like you saw in the previous slide, that our base training has gone well. We've been consistent, first order business, we've been consistent throughout the base training period. Like we just mentioned in that graphic, we've seen a steady increase in our FTP and in our 20-minute power. Now there could be that there's other metrics that you're tracking during this time that are showing you progression. But right now we're just kind of sticking to those basics that a lot of you might be familiar with. The third one is we're rested and we're motivated to attack the next training block. That's one that oftentimes goes without taking a closer look. But you've come through the winter, and let's say you've had a really challenging winter. Let's say you've missed a bunch of time. Let's say you've been sick. That's not a good time to start a really aggressive and really intense training block to prepare for a criterium. So you really need kind of all these different pieces here to make sure that you're ready to kind of step up and try something different. And then the fourth one is kind of going in combination with the third one, is that you really are interested in committing to a full 6-week block of focused training or prep for a criterium. If you're getting to this point in the season and you're finding yourself saying, I don't really know if I want to try this, or I read this or whatever, and you're kind of half committed, then this would not be the time to start this specific training block. So we're making these assumptions that really you're rested, you're highly motivated, you're really in great shape coming out the winter. And those are the things that we're using as the foundation before we begin this next step in our training plan. So next slide, please. So we've talked about this in a previous presentation here on What's Up with Power as well, but kind of taking a very brief look at this rider's individual strengths and limitations. So for this rider specifically, again, the seeing the details on the slide are less important than kind of the general concept. And this is a power profile that's very typical to, I would say, probably the majority of riders. And that is that they kind of have an average to below average sprint or explosive power, spanning those durations of 1 to 5 seconds all the way out to 1 minute, right? So this is these are kind of the specific limitations of this rider, and then their strengths begin to show up kind of as we get further out on that power duration timeline of like 4 minutes out there to 40 minutes to 1 hour. So two different ways to kind of display this. But when we look at this rider, before we begin to design this training plan, these are kind of what the strengths and limitations are that this specific rider is working with. If you had a different set of strengths and limitations, then the nature of our training plan might also look different. But for this specific rider, this is what we've got working with. So next slide, please. So the next one here. So we've utilized, or we've taken a closer look at these strengths and limitations. So now we kind of have this choice, and that is, what direction are we going to take with their training, right? So they have average to below average sprint and anaerobic power on the bike, but they have above average VO2 max and power at lactate threshold. So that again is reemphasizing what we saw in that graph. So then we kind of have this continuum where we make a choice in which direction we go. So we talked about this on a previous presentation as well. Do we go all the way to the left and target those limitations of sprint and anaerobic capacity? Or do we go all the way to the right and we spend a lot of time focused on continuing to improve their power at VO2 max, continue to improve their FTP, their endurance? And this is kind of the continuum that this is kind of the picture that we're always looking at when we're deciding which path to choose in terms of designing a training plan for a specific event and for a specific rider. And so for this specific training plan, we're going to trend a little bit towards targeting limitations, and you can see kind of where this dial slider is at. It's further over on the left, but we're not going to completely sell out and spend all of our time targeting those limitations, because we want to try and maintain all of those great aerobic fitness adaptations, FTP, endurance. We want to try and maintain all those adaptations that we worked hard on through the beginning of the season through the fall. Okay.
Cool day. And
so
today's Nana Day. Getting out with Nana.
Got some extra audio coming through.
I go to school.
Yep.
Mute that out. Yeah. So we have this choice to make here, where we have these two different paths, right? Do we go all the way at the limitations? Do we go all the way at the strengths? Do we stay right there in the middle? And for this one, because it's a criterium, and because we haven't had a lot of this riding over the winter, we want to trend a little bit more towards that target limitations side of the equation. So let's go to the next slide, please. So to kind of hammer home this point, remember that there are a lot of different paths to get to this target. And for us, this target is going to be success in our criterium. And there's a lot of different paths. I'm going to be demonstrating one path that might be effective, but you might have a different path, or there could be good debate on why this might not be the best training plan in this specific scenario, and different coaches might come up with different things. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that fact, is that training is experimentation, and really the best thing you can do in your training is try and set it up in such a fashion that you can make a quality decision at the end of that training to say that this was effective or it wasn't effective for me. So it doesn't do a lot of good to look at all kinds of different training plans and to maybe try this, because at the end of that type of experimentation, you're really unable to tell whether or not it was effective for you. So what we want to do in this training plan is we want to set it up in such a fashion that we can answer this question: was this a good training strategy for us over this 6 weeks? And if not, then let's try something different. But there are a lot of different ways to get there, and we're just talking about one of those ways. All right, next slide. So the next step, we've kind of set out some of these assumptions for our training plan. We've identified some strengths and weaknesses. We've made a choice in terms of kind of how we're going to target, or where we're going to target our abilities as we prepare for this criterium. So the next thing is we want to choose a progressive element that we're going to be looking at throughout these 6 weeks of our training plan. So first of all, this training plan is really designed on performance improvement, not so much on objective increases in our explosive power or anything like that. So our first progressive element really in this context is going to be winning or a podium. Now this would really be determined on what your goals are and what your success has been in a criterium before. But let's say in the past you've consistently been outside the top 10, and so you kind of have that that history of your success in a criterium. And for this criterium, or for subsequent criteriums, your goal really is being on the podium or winning. And in that sense, performance is your progressive element. That's how you're going to largely judge the success of this plan. Maybe it's being more aggressive in a race. So maybe in the past you've kind of been stuck in the mid pack, or maybe stuck in the back. And so maybe your progressive element is that you want to be able to demonstrate that you can be more aggressive. You can be involved in attacks. You can throw attacks. Or maybe that progressive element is just simply not getting dropped, right? So a progressive element doesn't have to be objective in a power sense. It could also be, in this sense, doing better in a criterium in a measurable way. So the way that we're, that if we were to measure what this would look like in terms of power, we would say this looks like improved anaerobic and sprint power at the finish of a race. So when it comes to success in a criterium, that's really what it's about. It's about being able to not just throw out high anaerobic or sprint power numbers, but really to be able to utilize what your best is at the finish of a race or in a fatigued state. So higher anaerobic power or sprint power is a bonus from this training plan, but it's really not the primary thing we're looking at. We're looking at what that looks like at the end of a race. So next slide, please. So to kind of illustrate what this looks like, what we have here is we have a power duration curve, and this is really the different types of power that the different ways that power could be improved in a typical cyclist. So we have increasing their power. We have being able to produce a specific power for longer. We have the ability to repeat power. So now we're kind of getting more into this criterium sense. And then the last one we have circled here is to produce our anaerobic power at the end of a race. So this just kind of illustrates again what we're going to be focusing on this training plan. So next slide, please. All right. So some of the first steps for this planning process before we begin to lay out some specific pieces. First, we want to make sure that you have some zones, or that you have some levels that you're comfortable with before we begin to utilize those in our workout. So we're going to start our training plan, and I think you should start each of your training plans or blocks of training with some type of test. So whether or not that's a power test, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a threshold or fitness test. You might want to do, and what I would do starting this plan, is some specific testing in these durations that we're going to be working through. So these anaerobic power and sprint power durations, we want to do some testing to see what we're working with, and to also make sure that when you're executing these workouts, that you're doing them at a proper intensity that's really challenging and pushing you, right? So we're going to start each of our plans with some basic testing to make sure that the targets that we're utilizing in our workouts are accurate. We want to schedule our available training time, and we're going to demonstrate that. We've talked about that in the past. We're going to show what that looks like on a calendar. And then we want to design a progressive sequence of workouts targeting our performance objectives. And we had talked about that before, which is aerobic sprint power at the finish of a race. And then to kind of finish off this 6-week training plan, we want to demonstrate how we might taper into that final race at the end of that period. So we've talked about kind of all those building blocks and kind of the thought process that goes into designing this training plan over the stretch of time. And now let's see what that looks like in a sense on the calendar. So if we can go to the next slide here. So again, you can't see the details of these most likely when you're viewing this presentation, but I just want to talk about the thought process a little bit and these specific workouts that we have on the calendar and how they relate to our objectives in designing this plan. So the first one is bullet number one. First of all, we can see here that like Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays are the days that we're going to take off. So we've looked at our available training time, and those are the days that are going to work for us. So we're going to stick to Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Those are going to be our primary days where we get our workouts in. So I want to talk about the thought process of why we utilize these workouts and how they match up to our goals and objectives for this training plan. So the first one is we have a series of workouts where we're focused on specific anaerobic power and improving that ability to push to push higher numbers in these kind of explosive durations. So that's workout number one. So that's going to be targeting that objective of introducing some specific intensity or intensity that's specific to our Criterium prep. And then the second workout is going to, rather than focus on pushing higher outputs, it's going to focus on maintaining that higher power output for a longer amount of time, right? So again, specific to our Criterium prep. The third workout that we have there on Saturday, we're talking about tempo. It's a tempo workout where we have different sprint type exercises. So again, specific to our Criterium objectives. And this is, again, what's important to kind of illustrate our path in this training plan. For the fourth workout of the week on Sunday, we're revisiting some of that threshold or sub-threshold intensity. So if you go back to that slide where we talk about the continuum of targeting our strengths or targeting our limitations, this is embodying that choice, right? Where we're trending towards the left, where we're focusing on our limitations. So we have workouts that are focused on improving our anaerobic power capacity, but then we're not forgetting about that importance of doing our best to maintain those primarily aerobic fitness adaptations that we worked on throughout the entire winter to get us to that point, right? So then the second week is following some of those same guidelines where we have more explosive. We have another explosive workout targeting anaerobic power capacity on that's labeled as number 5. And then we have another one of those on number 6. Number 7, we have a longer hill ride where again we want to try and hang on to those adaptations, those threshold adaptations that we worked hard to accumulate over the fall. And then on Sunday, again, you see we revisit this sub-threshold intensity to try and hang on to those FTP adaptations. So again, this is a specific application of preparing for a criterium, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how we connect what our goals are and what our choice is in terms of training path to specific workouts and what those look like in a progressive sense over just a couple weeks of this training plan. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in this slide, we kind of jump ahead to the final week 6 of this training plan, where we kind of try and put all these elements together. And again, this gives you kind of a basic example of how we might do this. Now, rather than we started working right in trying to improve really trying to stress our ability to produce maximal power in an aerobic sense. And now, as we become closer to this criterium, we're making that a little bit more specific, where a workout that's labeled number 1 is about repeatable anaerobic power. So first we started with how high can we go, and then we stretched out a little bit to the duration that we can produce power anaerobically. And then now we're looking at anaerobic power in a repeatable sense, which again, ideally should be lining up with what our overall goals are, which is improved performance in this criterion. So in this final week before we head off to a race, we've got workout labeled number 1, which is about repeatable anaerobic power. workout number 2, which is really about kind of honing our neuromuscular control. So thinking about sprinting at the finish of a race. We have a short tune-up, and then we have, you know, the prep for race day. So again, we don't have a lot of time to go through, you know, every single step of a workout plan in this sense, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how to develop a thought process to put together these details, from implementation to planning, and then to actually putting specific workouts on a calendar that work in a progressive sense to help you reach your goals. So next slide, please. So at the finish, right, we want to assess the effectiveness of our plan. So did it work? Now, if you won your criterium, then it could be, you know, that you would say, well, yeah, I think the plan worked. Now, when performance is our assessment metric, obviously things can get a little bit dicey, because in a race, not everything is under our control. It could have been that, you know, we made a mental mistake that maybe didn't reflect the effectiveness of the plan. You know, there's a lot of different variables that might impact our ability to do well in a race, but it's still important to say, to look at that. If that's what our primary way of assessing the quality of the plan is, it's still important to at least take a look at that. So whether or not the plan worked or not, then, you know, we'd want to answer that question, whether or not we're looking at power or looking at, you know, how well we did in that race as a performance metric. And then we go back a little bit and just say, okay, if it did or didn't work, let's say we feel the plan didn't work, then we'd ask the question, well, were we consistent in following the plan? Right? The only way to assess whether or not it's effective is whether or not you were able to follow it with consistency. So were you consistent in following the plan? Well, what was the good and the bad of the plan? You know, were the workouts, did they overwhelm you? Did they seem like they were a little bit too much for you? Was the duration of did the duration of the workout fit your actual time schedule? So this is an opportunity to look back again and not just do the plan and then move on to the next training block, but to really try and learn from what worked and what didn't work from the plan. Were the workouts, you know, did they match the terrain to where you ride? Did you find that the intervals didn't really fit with the access that you have? Did you find that the workouts were too long because you're stuck indoors and you're riding on Zwift, and you do a lot better with a workout that's an hour, right? So whether or not the plan was effective or not effective, don't just leave it there. Look back and say, how might I, you know, improve upon not just this specific type plan, but improve upon future training blocks to make sure that I have a chance for more, you know, for more success. And then what we talked about before, did you make measurable progress? So in this plan, this is not the same as a plan where you might be specifically targeting increases in your FTP. In that type of plan, it might be much easier to see progression throughout that plan and to say, well, yes, I made measurable progress and I saw that my FTP went from here to here to here. This is a plan where we might not be able to see that in an objective sense, because that's not really what we're targeting. We're targeting race performance. So like we talked about before, look at all those different areas and do your best to determine whether or not there were objective measures of progress there. So last slide, developing a plan. So this is kind of a summary of what we talked about. So first off, we talked about you know, reviewing that developing a plan steps, those 1 through 4 steps that we talked about in a previous presentation. Identifying your strengths and limitations, and after doing that, choosing a specific path and a strategy. Are you going to target your limitations? Are you going to target your strengths? Where is that going to take you in developing your plan? And then identify a progressive element in this plan that you're going to utilize to guide your workouts. So is that anaerobic power? Is that FTP? Is that power at VO2 max? Is that time spent in an aerodynamic position as you work to improve your time trial? Whatever it is, make sure that there's a progressive element in that training plan that you're able to tie together in each of your workouts as you move through that training plan. Make sure that, you know, as you're designing that plan, like we talked about, you can demonstrate progression throughout a calendar. And then when you're finished, make sure you have some type of an assessment tool to learn from that period of training, to make sure that you can implement lessons from that training plan, lessons that you've learned from that training plan into future blocks of training. So I know we talked about a lot of content here, and it's difficult sometimes to kind of bridge that gap between being specific and being general. But right now we're going to jump straight into a Q&A. And if you have questions about how you might apply some of these principles to your specific scenario, you can feel free to hammer away.
Awesome. And we actually have a question right off the bat that moves us directly to the other side of the training spectrum. It says, so if we were to change this from, I'll just read it. How would you modify this plan for a 1-hour hill climbing race versus a crit? assuming the athlete has a similar power profile.
Sure. So I would assume that the 1 hour hill climb would maybe be a pretty consistent application of power.
Yeah.
So in this sense, in a lot of ways, this is you could say maybe an easier application, because the strengths of this rider, if we're using this same type of power profile or strengths and limitations, really lines up probably a little bit better with this hill climb than it does with the Criterium. So in this sense, I would go through that same thought process. That same thought process and say, okay, my overall objective is to perform well in this 1 hour hill climb. My strengths and limitations are we've lined them up in that same fashion. And then for me, if I'm looking at this same continuum, I would basically reverse the pattern of I would reverse the pattern that we kind of outlined in that continuum that we showed in that slide, where I would take that slider and I would move it over to the right. I wouldn't go exclusively all the way over to just targeting those strengths. I think it's important to still add some of those elements of explosive training and training your anaerobic capacity. So I wouldn't move the slider all the way over to just longer threshold type intervals, but I would definitely switch my focus over towards that camp. So we move over, we develop a path. We say this is how we're going to target this rider's strengths and limitations. And then after we've done that, then I would choose what my progressive element is. So it really depends on what your experience level is. If you've done a lot of 60-minute hill climbs, then maybe my progressive element might be focused on increasing your power over different threshold durations up to that 60 minutes. If you've never done 60 minutes of threshold power, like a lot of riders have never done a full 60, I've never done a full 60 minutes at threshold. There's no climbs in my area that challenge me in that sense. So if that was the case, where you haven't done full 60 minutes, then my progressive element would look different, and that is that it would be about stretching that time at threshold that you could spend to get you up to that 60 minutes by the time you reach that hill climb. So it might be that you start out doing 2x20s, and then you might do 2x25s, and you might do 2x30s, and you might do some 5x10s, and then so however you might break that up, we would be trying to stretch that time for you to reach that 60-minute goal. So I would choose that progressive element, and then utilize that as you plan out that progression in your calendar of workouts. And then, just like we talked about, I would come to race day and then see what worked. Did your performance improve? Did your power over that 60-minute duration, did it improve? How well did you follow the plan? Were the workouts, did they fit into your calendar, right? How can we learn from that to make better decisions about how we train going forward?
Awesome. So that question, actually, I know the person who asked it. They're asking specifically, they were training for the Mount Diablo hill climb challenge, not too far from your neck of the woods, but
very close. Yeah,
far enough away that you wouldn't go training there often.
Yeah, I've ridden that climb a couple different times. It's a keystone climb here for kind of the Bay Area, Sacramento area. So I have some athletes that have ready access to Mount Diablo, and and that's a great asset, because it's kind of a long sustained climb. And it's really what that affords you is this incredible, it's like real life Zwift, where you have this element where you can ride with consistency, and you can stretch out, and you can have this beautiful progression to kind of get you up to that final goal, which is it's for the full hill climb. For other people, they might not have that ability to kind of have that full progression.
So actually, this kind of leads into a good question that we had here in the game. Somebody said, hey, I train 90% indoors. Is that okay? And so I'll let you, I have a couple answers, but I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Oh, I would say, is that okay? I would say it depends on what your goals are. So if your goals are ultimately to do really well outside, in an outdoor event, then I would say, I don't think is that okay is probably the best way to answer it, or the best way to answer that question. It's to work with what you have. So if those are the limitations that you have, and that primarily 90% of your time is spent indoors, then we say, okay, let's work with that to best try and prepare you for whatever your event is. And if that event is outside, then we would try and utilize different strategies to get the most out of that indoor time, and then make sure that we're looking at your calendar in the same progressive sense, and say, if 90% of your time is spent indoors, but you're preparing for a century outdoors, then let's make sure that at least 2 times out of the month that we can introduce you to some of this outdoor riding to make sure that you're comfortable maybe with different conditions outside, maybe where you're riding is windy and you want to make sure you feel comfortable handling your bike or around other riders. Or so I think really how we look at that is we say, what is it that you're preparing for, and then how can we make sure that we're introducing you to those stressors in a progressive sense as best as we can, utilizing the limitations that you have with your training to make sure that you're prepared. So whatever you have available to you is what we work with, is what you should work with. And whether or not that's good or bad, I think is probably less irrelevant. And that is, how do we make sure that whatever you have, that we're working to kind of prepare for whatever your target event is.
Yeah, great answer. And I think taking that and applying it to the couple scenarios we had here with like a 1 hour long hill climb, if you live in the middle of flatland USA or a really big city where it takes a really long time to get out of the city and you're stuck with traffic lights or whatever, you may not have a place you could go to frequent enough to do sustained efforts at the duration you need to train for that 60-minute effort. So in that case, you may rely on using indoors because you can hold that power for longer and push yourself. Taking the other end of it, so we think, a crit, okay, shorter efforts, I can do those either place. While the other part with crits specifically is bike handling and cornering and drafting and strategy. And you might be able to learn some of that on Zwift, but it's certainly not the same as real life. And so a lot of crit is not only your power, but your smarts of race making decisions. And so I'd say the other component of a crit training plan is just getting in more and more crits. They're short enough that you kind of have to see them play out over and over and over to be able to understand all of the tactics and be able to, place well and affect the race. Do you agree with those?
Yeah, well, that brings up a really good point. And obviously, in this training plan, we're really talking about kind of exclusively training the physical side of preparing for crits. And like Justin said, anyone that's done a crit can tell you can have all the physical tools to do well on a crit, but if you don't ride efficiently, if you aren't able to corner effectively, if you don't feel comfortable in a bunch, and riding behind riders to conserve energy, all these different types of things can ultimately have a much greater impact on your ability to do well on a criterium than all the physical tools. So Justin brings up a really good point in that, we talked about the physical side of this, but the other side of this, obviously, is that if you're not riding regularly on a criterium, that you're doing group rides outdoors with friends and that you're exposing yourself to all those other tools of bike racing, from understanding how to read a race to, how to be able to react quickly and apply your brakes in such a fashion where you're not a danger to other riders. And, we could come up with a whole list of what it takes to ride a criterium well outside of just being physically prepared. So, it really depends, again, on what your goals are and how you're going to introduce yourself to that. So if your goal was to do your first criterium, I would say we would look at 2 different pieces of this puzzle, where we would look at the physical side, and then we would look at introducing you progressively to more and more challenging scenarios. So that might be, be involved in this group ride that has, a small number of riders, and then go to the larger, area group ride on this day, to get some additional experience there. But making sure that you're paying attention to kind of those outside environmental factors to whatever your event is really important. Whether or not that's a hill climb that might be really windy, or whether or not that's a criterium and a race type scenario.
Awesome. Nate, that's about all the time we have for today. So we're going to say thank you again for your time. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you for putting in all this work. We appreciate it. We all benefit from it, and we are so glad you donate the time for us. So if you guys want to have any further questions for Nate, his contact information is here on the screen. Data Driven Athletes, the name of their business. You can contact him directly via email, nate@datadrivenathlete.com. Lots of awesome content coming out of there. So with that, we'll be back on again next week. Same time, same channel, 6:30 a.m. Pacific. Also later on this afternoon, we'll have a skills and drills ride where you can ride along with Ian Murray, and he'll talk through a lot of the tactics we talked about: reading a race, understanding, bridging, attacking. These are things that there are tools in the tool chest that you need to have to, once you got the power, apply it to the right tools. And so he covers a lot of that, and so that's a great resource to attend if you can make that. Or we do have the recordings afterwards if you just want to listen through and kind of see what it's all about. So with that, we will say thank you for coming, sign off, and hope you have a wonderful day.